wandering.
Moscow, Russia, which is one of the world's richest cities, is home to more billionaires than any other European city. But if you travel just 10 miles south of Moscow's richest neighborhood, the Golden Mile, you will reach one of Russia's poorest neighborhoods, the southern Moscow suburbs. Nicknamed Zhopamira, which means the soul of the world, these suburbs used to be a thriving neighborhood with tens of thousands of working-class Russians and their families calling it their home. But after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the money and the jobs in this area dried up completely, and even though the residents wanted to relocate and live somewhere with more opportunity, they couldn't. They didn't have the resources to leave, and so they were trapped. And since 1991, really nothing has changed in these suburbs. Today, there are still tens of thousands of now very poor Russian families that still live there, living in these totally overcrowded Soviet apartment buildings that are these big, square, identical-looking things that are literally falling apart. And most of the people who live in these suburbs either are unemployed or they work some dead-end job that barely pays them any money. The police in the suburbs are completely underfunded and, for the most part, are corrupt. And so crime over the years has really taken a dramatic uptick. Also, drug and alcohol abuse are completely running rampant in this part of the world. But despite their notoriously rough living situation in the southern Moscow suburbs, these residents do have one claim to fame, and that is the Bitsevsky Park. Bitsevsky Park is comprised primarily of a massive, lush green forest that is full of wildlife and beautiful streams and clearings, and it sits right on the southern edge of the southern Moscow suburbs. In total, the park covers a whopping 2,700 acres and stretches 4 miles from top to bottom, which makes it 3 times bigger than New York City's famous Central Park. Bitsevsky Park had always been a popular tourist destination for people living around Moscow, but after the fall of the Soviet Union, the park's popularity skyrocketed, specifically amongst people that lived in the southern Moscow suburbs. As their lives continued to become more bleak in the 1990s, they compensated by going to the park as much as they possibly could. They would take long walks in the woods, they would play chess with their friends along the peripheries on the park benches and tables, or they'd go cross-country skiing in the winter. Basically, year-round, this park became their escape from their miserable everyday lives. But that would not last. Starting in the early 2000s, something totally unexplainable and terrifying began happening in the park, specifically in the heavily forested area in the park. And eventually, this unusual event that was taking place got so completely out of hand that the residents of the southern Moscow suburbs stopped going in the park. They were literally too scared to go inside. The strange phenomenon began in 2001. From May to July that year, 10 people went missing after having been spotted either in or right around the outside of the heavily forested area inside of Bitsevsky Park. All of them were alone when they were last spotted, and all of them were men. Now, there was some precedent for people suddenly going missing in this part of Russia. Every now and again, people would try to flee these suburbs to try to make a better life for themselves somewhere else, but time and time again, they would just come back a couple of days or weeks later because it hadn't worked out. But when these 10 men did not come back in a couple of days or weeks, their families went to police and reported them missing. But unsurprisingly, the police did not launch an investigation. Instead, they accused the 10 missing men of just being drunk bums who probably wandered off somewhere, and whatever trouble they were in, it was their fault. Now, the families and the locals did not buy this explanation, but there really wasn't a better explanation. These men really had just kind of vanished. No one had any idea where they went. And so given the kind of general grim outlook on life that lots of people held in this area, people just kind of accepted that whatever happened to these 10 men happened, and there's nothing any of us can do about it. And they moved on. But in October of that year, so 2 months after the 10th man had gone missing in the park, another man went missing in the park. And then by the end of the year, 4 more men had vanished inside of the park. And all of them vanished under the same circumstances, last spotted alone in or around the heavily forested area in the park. The families of these 5 men would go to police. They would report their family members missing. But again, the police did not launch any investigation and blamed the missing people for being responsible for whatever happened to them. And then after that, the families kind of mourned the loss of these 5 men, not really sure what to make of it. And locals kind of gossiped about it for a little while and started to speculate about what might have happened to them and kind of lumped them in with the 10 other men that had gone missing. But after a while, when no new news came out about what happened to them, everyone just kind of moved on again. And unbelievably, this pattern would repeat itself for nearly 4 years. From 2002 to late 2005, 25 more people would go missing inside of Bitsevsky Park. 24 of them would be men, 1 of them would be a woman, although it wasn't clear if she was actually in the same category as the other 24 men, but regardless, that put the total number of mysterious disappearances inside of this forested area in the park up to 40. But still, the police shrugged it off, and eventually, so too did the local population. Everyone just kind of moved on, like this phenomenon wasn't happening, that people were not going missing in droves inside of this forest. But everything would change with missing person number 41, because unlike the previous 40, this missing person would be found again. 63-year-old Nikolai Zakharchenko was a retired police officer who lived in a tiny apartment in the southern Moscow suburbs with his family. He was a classic Russian tough guy who chain-smoked cigarettes and drank lots of vodka. And even though he was well aware of the missing person phenomenon inside of this park, that wasn't about to stop him from doing the thing he loved, which was going on walks inside of this park. He figured whatever was out there, he could handle it. So one evening in November of 2005, Nikolai told his sister that he was going to go out for a walk in the park. But that night, he didn't come back. And so his family was very worried about him, but they decided they would wait until the next morning to see if maybe he showed up. But the following morning, when Nikolai did not show up, his family went to the police. But per usual, the police did nothing. A few days later, a local was walking fairly deep inside of the forest inside of Bitsevsky Park when they noticed well off the trail, off to the left side, there was something unusual kind of tucked in the underbrush. Now, this local was all alone. They had kind of a bad feeling about whatever this was. And so they called the police and they reported seeing something strange. And surprisingly, the police did actually come out and they went over to investigate, and they found this unusual thing was Nikolai Zakharchenko. He was lying face down, he was fully clothed, and he only had 1 injury, but it obviously had been fatal. He had a massive hole on the back of his head. This was not from a gunshot. This was from massive blunt force trauma. He had been struck so hard that literally the back half of his skull was blown clear off. The police searched the area in hopes they might find the murder weapon or some other clue as to what happened to him, but there was nothing. And so all the police could deduce was that Nikolai had obviously been attacked either by a person or group of people or even an animal, and that whoever his attacker was or whatever his attacker was had clearly snuck up on him, given the location of his injury. Now that the police had a body, and it likely looked like it was a murder, they could no longer ignore the fact that so many people had gone missing inside of this park, and it was looking like probably if they looked around the park, they might find more bodies. So the local police called in reinforcements from Russia's Criminal Investigation Department, and they came to the southern Moscow suburbs, and with the local police, they began searching every inch of this park looking for more bodies, or just for any indication of who or what was behind this attack and behind all these missing people. But after several days of a very extensive search where they looked everywhere in this park, all over the forested area, they found nothing. At the same time this huge police search was going down inside of Bitsevsky Park, news about Nikolai's death had spread amongst the southern Moscow suburbs, and people were now getting really scared. Before, the fear of the park felt kind of theoretical because there were no bodies. And so even though it seemed far-fetched, it did seem possible that maybe all these people were getting lost on their own, that they really were just drunks stumbling off. But now, with the discovery that one of these missing people had been horrifically killed, that made the danger associated with this park feel very real. And so it was around this time that most residents of these suburbs stopped going inside of this park in fear of whatever was out there in the forest. And they would forbid their children from going in, and they would tell their neighbors, don't go in the park. And they gave this evil thing that lurked in the forest that caused men to disappear and attacked Nikolai, they gave this thing a name. They called it the Bitsevsky Park Maniac. But despite the fear of this maniac causing so many people to avoid this park, and despite the massive police presence that was in the park constantly looking for bodies, looking for clues, and just generally patrolling the area, despite all that, people still continued to go missing in this park. Starting just a week after the discovery of Nikolai's body in November of 2005, all the way up to April of 2006, 9 more men would mysteriously vanish in the forested section of Bitsevsky Park. And just like Nikolai, just a couple of days after they were reported missing by their families, they would be found lying out in the middle of the park with the backs of their heads caved in. But unlike Nikolai, most of these 9 victims had been found with a glass bottle jammed into the hole in the back of their head, meaning almost certainly this was the work of a human, not some animal. By this point, almost no one was stepping foot inside of the park, because it was basically common knowledge that, a serial killer is obviously on the loose in the forest. But despite this, there were still some very stubborn people who continued to go inside of the park. And one of those people was 32-year-old Alexander Bachushkin. He had been born in the southern Moscow suburbs, and he still lived with his family in the same tiny apartment he had grown up in. It's safe to say Alexander's life had been more difficult than his peers. When he was just 4 years old, he fell backwards off of a swing, and when he sat up, he was okay, but the swing came swinging back and smashed him in the front of the head, causing brain damage. Now, his family did not have the money to send him to a hospital, and so when he stood up after getting struck and he was kind of able to walk around and he seemed okay, they determined he was fine and they didn't follow up. But Alexander was not fine. The injury had impaired his cognitive abilities, and years later, when he went to school, the other kids would bully him for sounding dumb. By the time Alexander was in high school, he felt like an outcast. He didn't have any friends, and he was miserable. But his grandfather, who lived in the same apartment complex as he did, he noticed this about Alexander, and he decided he would take him under his wing and he would look after him. And so the first thing he did is he asked Alexander to come over, and he taught him how to play chess, believing that would be something they could bond over. And when he taught Alexander the rules of this game, which are quite complicated, it was like it opened up the secret portion of Alexander's brain that had never been opened before. Alexander immediately absorbed all this information about chess and became a master of it practically overnight. Within a couple of days of being taught how to play, he was beating his grandfather virtually every time they played together. And so his grandfather was totally thrilled about this and was very proud of Alexander. And so he decided to bring Alexander down to Bitsevsky Park, where all these old men who were total chess masters were always playing chess on all of the park benches and tables. And so he brought Alexander down there and he put him up against all of these incredible players, and very quickly Alexander was wiping the floor with them. And they loved him for it. He was their star. He was their prodigy. They totally adored him and they respected him. And when they found out he was getting bullied at school, they made a point of telling him that he would always have a place with them in this park. And so for Alexander, this was like the best moment of his life. He finally felt like he was accepted, and he finally felt happy. And so over the years, even after Alexander's grandfather passed away, Alexander continued to go down to Bitsevsky Park to play chess virtually every day. And he kept going to the park to play chess, even when men began going missing in the park, including some of the men he played chess with. And Alexander continued going to the park to play chess, even after bodies began piling up in the park. Alexander's mother was terrified for him and felt like he didn't understand the risk he was putting himself in by going to this park all the time. But every time she pleaded with him not to go, just take one day off from playing chess, Alexander would say, "Mom, I'm gonna be fine." And then he would leave anyways. In April of 2006, Alexander was 32 years old and worked for a local grocery store stocking shelves. By this point, at least 50 people had vanished mysteriously in the forested section of the park, and 10 bodies had been found. On the morning of the 12th of that month, Alexander showed up to the grocery store for his shift, and right away he noticed there was a new employee. It was this beautiful older woman he had never seen before, and Alexander, while he was confident playing chess, was not remotely confident around women. He had never had a girlfriend before. But he found himself looking at this woman across the store, feeling like she was different, that she was more approachable than other women. And so he told himself that day he was going to go up to her and he was going to say hi. And so all through his shift, he kind of awkwardly watched this woman from a distance, kind of building up his confidence. And then at the end of his shift, her shift was also ending, the pair walked outside at the same time, and Alexander was about to say something, but he just couldn't find his voice. And then he noticed this woman had put a cigarette in her mouth, but she was fishing around for her lighter, like she couldn't find it. And so Alexander jumped into action and pulled his own lighter out, and he held it out to her and said, "Hey, can I light your cigarette?" And so before long, the two were chatting, and they were walking together and smoking their cigarettes. And over the course of their conversation, Alexander would learn this woman was named Larissa Kolegina, and she was 48 years old, and she lived near Alexander's apartment. And so after they walked for a little while, they arrived in front of her apartment building, and at this point, Alexander knows she's about to go inside, and so he suddenly feels bold, and he asks Larissa, "Hey, do you want to continue walking around with me for a bit and maybe do a pass through the park?" Now, at this point, the Bitsevsky Park was totally not a place you would bring people to. This is a place that everyone in the area is basically terrified of. But for Alexander, Bitsevsky Park was like his happy place. And so naturally, if he's going to take a woman on a date, that's where he's going to bring her. And surprisingly, Larissa was very quick to say, "Oh, let's go to the park." And so the two, they lit up another cigarette and they walked across the road and they walked through the front gates of the park. Their first stop was the chess tables along the periphery of the park right outside of the forest, and the tables were totally empty. But at this point, that wasn't surprising given the fact that even amongst diehard chess players, really Alexander was the only one still willing to go back in there every single day. And so after seeing where Alexander spent all of his time, it seemed like it was time to turn around and leave. But neither Alexander nor Larissa wanted their date to end, and so they decided to light up another cigarette and then follow a walking path that kind of looped into the forest and came back out again. And as they entered the woods and got deeper and deeper into the forest, the chess tables that were behind them faded from view, and the sky began to get darker and darker as it was getting late. But the pair just kept on walking, maintaining their cheerful conversation. But at some point, as they talked and walked, the path below their feet stopped looking like the path they had originally set out on. Now they're stepping over broken logs and they're ducking under low-hanging branches, and it's not really clear if they're on a marked trail anymore. But neither of them bring it up. They just maintain their kind of light conversation and continue walking as if nothing's going on. However, they both definitely began walking faster and faster to maybe speed up this loop. But at some point, when it was very obvious they were no longer on a path, they both came to a stop. As they had walked, Alexander had been in front, and so when they came to a stop, he turned around and he looked at Larissa, and right away he could tell there was just something wrong about her. There was a look on her face that just didn't look right. She looked exhausted or sad or something. And then as he's looking at her, she inexplicably kind of collapses into a tree right next to her, and she grabs the tree with her arms and she slides down to its base, and she presses her cheek and her chest up against its bark, and she begins to cry. Alexander has no idea what's going on, so he just stands there staring at her. And in between sobs, Larissa looks up at Alexander and says, "You're the maniac, aren't you?" Alexander couldn't believe it. She was the first person to figure it out so quickly. Normally, he would have to tell his victims before he killed them. And so he smirked and he looked at her and he said, "Yes, I am." And so Larissa, at this point, she lets out this huge sob and she looks down and she keeps crying. And then she looks back up again at him and she says, "Are you going to kill me?" And without any hesitation, Alexander looks at her and he says, "Yes, I am." And then he reached into his jacket and he pulled out a hammer. No one knows for sure why Alexander became a serial killer or why he almost exclusively targeted men. Many people believe it might have something to do with the brain damage he suffered as a 4-year-old when that swing hit him in the head, that somehow that rewired his brain and made him more aggressive towards other people, especially men. But that's just speculation. And other than that injury, there really isn't much in Alexander's life that stands out as a big red flag. He just kind of floated about his life and followed the crowd. But in 1992, when he was 18 years old, he got this urge to kill, and he actually decided to act on it. He brought up this desire to a classmate of his named Mikhail Odachuk, and surprisingly, Mikhail says to Alexander, "I want to kill someone too. Let's do it together." And so the two met up a couple of days later and they headed off to Bitsevsky Park and began walking around the forest looking for a lone person that could be their victim. And as they're walking along, Alexander, he's fully committed, but he can tell Mikhail is not. He's starting to get cold feet and he's talking about, maybe let's stop for now and head back and maybe do this another time. And Alexander, he's getting more and more angry and frustrated with Mikhail until finally Alexander decides, my first victim will be Mikhail. And so he turns to Mikhail and he says, "You know what? If you want to head back, you can." And Mikhail says, "Okay, maybe we can do this another time, right?" And Alexander says, "Sure." And so Mikhail turns around, and as soon as his back is to Alexander, Alexander pulls out his hammer and he smashes Mikhail in the back of the skull, causing Mikhail to crumple to the ground, either dead or unconscious. But either way, he's laying on the ground. And as soon as he is, Alexander remembers that they had passed a little while earlier this well kind of hidden in the middle of the forest. And so he grabbed Mikhail's body and he dragged him through the forest over to this well. And when he got to the well, he pulled the lid off of it, and then he picked Mikhail's body up, pushed him up and over the edge, and dropped him inside. And Mikhail fell 30 feet all the way down to the icy water below. And then Alexander put the lid back on the well, he grabbed his hammer off the ground, and he left. An important part of Alexander's killing was this well. This well was not a drinking water well. It was basically an access point to this deep underground sewer system that stretched all around the underside of this park. And so when Mikhail fell down this 30-foot shaft, he didn't just land at a pit of water right at the bottom of the well. Instead, he fell all the way down the shaft until it opened up like the bottom of a huge scientific beaker. It was basically like this big cave at the bottom of the well that was full of very deep water. And so Mikhail would have splashed into that water, which was icy cold, and then after Alexander put the lid on top of the well, it would have been pitch black inside of that space. Now, even if it had been lit up, there was no ladder for Mikhail to climb back out of. And there was a current running through this well because there were tunnels leading into it and then out the other side. And so Mikhail, if he woke up, if he was conscious when he hit the water, he would have immediately been swept into another tunnel. And many of the other tunnels that led away from this cave space were completely filled with water. And so he would have had nowhere to breathe. He would have been sucked into a tunnel and he would have drowned. And so whether Mikhail died from the strike on the back of the head or whether he drowned, we don't know. But he died after being thrown in the well. And then his body was swept miles and miles away to some deep underwater recess where nobody was looking. Alexander would wait another 9 years before he killed again. But once he started up again, he didn't stop. His first kill after the hiatus was in the summer of 2001. His victim was a man he liked to play chess with. In fact, this was a man that loved Alexander and was definitely one of Alexander's friends. They regularly played chess with each other. And one day in May, after a game of chess, Alexander asked the man if he wanted to head into the forest to pay respects to his dog, who he had buried out in this forest. And he told the man he was going to have a sip of vodka over his dog's grave. And so this chess friend of his agrees to go with Alexander because he loves Alexander. He's a good friend of his, and says, absolutely, let's go pay our respects to your dog. And so the pair begin walking into the forest, and at first they're on a trail, but eventually Alexander says to this man that you need to leave the trail in order to get to the gravesite. So the man says, yeah, no problem. And so they get off the trail and they're walking for a little while until they reach the well. And when they get to the well, Alexander stops and he kind of points to some arbitrary spot on the ground and says, oh, that's where my dog was buried. And so Alexander pulls out a bottle of vodka and he takes a swig, and then he hands it to the man, who does the same thing to kind of do this commemorative drink for this dog. And then afterwards, Alexander looks at his friend and kind of gestures with his arm to get the man to, take them back out of the forest, back out to the chess tables. And so the man turns around and begins backtracking. And as soon as he does, and his back is to Alexander, Alexander pulls out his hammer, he walks up behind his friend, and he smashes him over the back of the head. And then, just like Mikhail, he drags this man's body over to the edge of the well, he pulls the lid of the well off, and then he lifts this man up, and he dumps him into the well shaft, and then he puts the lid back on top. Alexander continued to lure his victims out to that well, and all of his victims were people he knew. They were his chess friends. They were his neighbors in his apartment complex. They were anyone he had a personal relationship with. He would later say that that was his preferred victim. He liked to know the person he was killing. It made him feel like God. Amazingly, it would turn out not all of Alexander's victims who were chucked into that well actually died. Victims number 16 and 17, who were a pregnant woman and a 13-year-old boy respectively, after they had their heads smashed with a hammer and they got chucked into the well, their clothing got caught on a snag poking out of the inside of that 30-foot shaft, and it literally arrested their fall and kept them from plummeting all the way into the water. And somehow, in both instances, Alexander didn't notice. He just put the well lid back on and walked away, believing they were both dead. But they weren't, and after they regained consciousness, they were able to kind of claw their way back up the well shaft and pulled themselves out of the well. Both victims would go to the police, and both of them would positively identify who their attacker was, Alexander. But the police didn't care. In fact, they told both of these victims that they needed to drop the charges and leave them alone. And if they didn't, they, the police, would come up with something to have both of them arrested, the victims. And so Alexander got away with it, and the victims were literally intimidated by the police to stay quiet. And so that led to dozens and dozens more murders. In April of 2006, after Alexander told Larissa he was the maniac and he was going to kill her, he walked behind her as she cried and continued to hold on to the tree, and he wound up his hammer and brought it smashing into the back of her head. And then as she slumped to the ground, he hit her several more times in the back of the head with the hammer, and then he pulled out a vodka bottle and he jammed it inside of the hole, and then he left. 2 months later, Alexander would lure another woman out into the middle of the forest with him. Her name was Marina. She was 35 years old, and she had met Alexander while working at the grocery store with him. She actually was hired to work at the grocery store to fill Larissa's now vacant spot. Before Alexander and Marina began their walk out to the park, which was Alexander's suggestion, Marina said she just needed to stop by her apartment to let her son know where she was going. And so they swung by her apartment. Marina went upstairs and she left a note for her teenage son saying where she was going and who she would be with, and she even left behind Alexander's name and his phone number on this note. And so when she came back out again and she and Alexander began walking towards the park, Alexander knew that if he killed her, which was his intention, that he would certainly be caught. The police were on super high alert at this point, and they would certainly get their hands on this note, and that would absolutely implicate him. And so he didn't really know what to do. knew. But by the time they were strolling into the forest, Alexander had decided he was going to kill her anyways. And many people believe he did this specifically to get caught, not to protect the public from himself, but because he wanted fame. He wanted recognition for what he had done. This theory stems from the fact that starting with his 41st victim, Nikolai Zakharchenko, Alexander began leaving his victims' bodies out in the open. He stopped putting them into that well. And he wouldn't just leave them out in the open. He would prop them up in strange poses against trees, and he would jam glass bottles into the holes in the backs of their heads, indicating he wanted the police to find them. That way, he could get all the credit he believed he deserved. When the police did finally arrest Alexander, they searched his apartment and they found this notebook. And in this notebook was a picture of a chessboard. Now, a chessboard has 64 squares on it, and in Alexander's notebook, this chessboard had 62 of the 64 squares filled in. And Alexander would explain to police that that was his scorecard. He had 62 victims. It would turn out 2 of those people had actually survived, the pregnant woman and the 13-year-old boy, but still, there were 60 murders accounted for in this notebook. Alexander would be fully cooperative with police and would tell them every detail he could possibly remember about every single killing, including what conversations were like with the person he killed right before he killed them. He would also often reenact what he did to the person and how he felt afterwards. It was very clear that Alexander was reveling in the attention he was getting from law enforcement, and it was very clear that he loved talking about killing. Ultimately, the police were only able to gather enough evidence to charge Alexander with 49 murders, not 60. And when Alexander heard this, he was totally disappointed, and he asked the judge if he could get credit for the other 11 murders to maintain his 60-victim mark. The judge said no. During his trial, Alexander was deemed to be such a threat, he was kept inside of a glass cage the entire time. And during the proceedings, he showed no remorse and in fact seemed kind of happy, like he was enjoying the spectacle of his trial. He was ultimately given the harshest penalty under Russian law at the time, which was life in prison without parole, and the first 15 years of his life sentence would be in complete and total solitary confinement. So virtually no human interaction, kept inside of his cell 24 hours a day with nothing in his cell all day long. Alexander is still alive today, and he is still in solitary confinement. In April of 2020, a 17-year-old named Sam, who was an avid outdoorsman, decided to go on a one-night hike in the Superstition Mountains in Arizona. The mountain's name has a bunch of supposed origins, but the one that's generally accepted is people are afraid of the Superstition Mountains because of all the mysterious deaths that have occurred there. And so because people would avoid these mountains in fear of mysterious death, it became these superstitious mountains. But Sam was not superstitious and regularly came out here to go hiking, in particular on this 8-mile loop that went through a canyon. And so this one night overnight he planned on doing was going to be on that 8-mile loop where he'd do 4 miles in, camp out, and then 4 miles back. And he planned to do it with a friend, but his friend at the last minute canceled, and so Sam teetered on not even doing it, but ultimately decided, okay, I'll just do it by myself because I'm very familiar with this area. On the day he was supposed to go do this hike, he had planned on getting there early in the day to have maximum lighting, but due to some unforeseen circumstances and traffic and bad road conditions, he didn't get to the trailhead until 5:45 p.m. that night. Sam knew it was a bad idea to start this hike so late because he was going to run out of daylight. He probably was not going to make it 4 miles to the point where he planned on camping out. But he figured with his good health and fitness, he could probably quickly make his way to the 2 or even 3 mile mark, and there were some suitable campsites there. And so he decided he would kind of risk it and just try to go as fast as he could and use the daylight he had to reach a suitable campsite. But he wasn't able to move as fast as he thought he could, and soon the sun was down and it's totally dark, and he's got his flashlight, but that only is able to shine like 10 feet in front of him. And then at one point he nearly falls off of this rock, and he knows had he fallen, he would have gotten really badly hurt, and he's 15 miles away from the nearest help, and he's in a bad cell phone service area, and the roads getting out here are treacherous. No one knows exactly where he is, and it dawns on him that you've made a pretty bad choice, and you should stop right now and make camp here and not try to risk it any further. And so as it happened, where he was, there was this forest right nearby, and he could see there was a clearing about 30 feet off the path when he shined his light. And so he walked into that clearing, and he found it was a great spot to make camp. And in fact, on the edge of this clearing was the remnants of a fire pit. It was very old, but it at least showed someone had camped out right here, and they seemed to have made it just fine. So suddenly he was feeling pretty smart, and he felt pretty good about where he was staying for the night. Now, Sam intentionally did not bring a tent. He liked to sleep on a sleeping pad with a sleeping bag over that, and then he would string up a tarp over the top of him in case it rained. And since this clearing was surrounded by a bunch of pine trees, he was able to string up his tarp over the top, and it was perfect. And pretty soon he had a fire going, and then he cracked open a can of beans, and he began eating his dinner. And as he was eating, he started to get a sense that something was off, something was not right. He began scanning the tree line as if he was going to find something out of the ordinary, but his visibility was incredibly limited because he was sitting right up against a fire. And if you've ever sat next to a fire in a dark forest, your visibility is like 5 feet in a circle around the fire. You really cannot see beyond that. And his vision was also limited by all the pine trees that encircled his clearing. So he really could only see what was immediately around him, nothing else. And he starts thinking, that's gotta be it. Maybe I'm just nervous because I have no visibility. But as he's rationalizing this kind of bad gut feeling, a rock the size of a marble comes soaring into the campsite and lands at his feet. And he looks down at the rock, and immediately he connects that to that sense of dread he had. And he's looking around a little more aggressively now, but again, his vision is very, very limited. And so for the next 15 minutes, Sam is really aggressively scanning the tree line and listening really intently, and he doesn't hear anything. He doesn't see any more rocks get thrown. And so he begins to rationalize and convince himself that there's nothing wrong here. That feeling I have, oh, don't worry about that. He starts telling himself, I must have kicked a rock. That's what it is. Or maybe a rock fell off a tree. But either way, it's something totally explainable and you got nothing to worry about. And after a little while, he convinced himself and he got into his sleeping bag under his tarp and he went to sleep. A couple of hours later, Sam wakes up and he has that same sense of dread, and now it's back with a vengeance. And he can't hear anything, he can't see anything, but he's definitely feeling like something is wrong. And at that moment, as he's listening really intently and looking really carefully, he hears the sound of rustling leaves. It sounds like someone walking through leaves about 30 or 40 meters away from his campsite. And initially, he can't tell if this person or animal is walking towards his campsite or away, but over the next 30 seconds or so, the sounds start to fade, and he convinces himself that, okay, they've left and everything's fine. But just in case, he wanted to grab his flashlight and shine it in that direction, and so he reaches next to him where he had left it when he had gone to bed a couple hours earlier, and he can't find his flashlight. He's looking around for it, and he can't find it, and he's like, man, that's weird. I had it right here, right next to my body, and it's not here anymore. And that's when the alarm bells start going off in his head, because the only way this flashlight moves is if he moved it. And if it's not here, how did it move? And so he jumps out of his sleeping bag, he ducks out from under the tarp, and he's looking around on the ground in the immediate vicinity of where he was sleeping to find this flashlight. And as he's looking, out of the corner of his eye, he sees some light. And he turns his head, and in the same direction that he had heard those footsteps, those rustling leaves, when he was still laying down, he sees his flashlight laying on the ground about 10 meters away, which means someone or something had been less than a foot away from him to get this flashlight that was right next to him while he was fast asleep and totally helpless, and had moved it all the way over there. And immediately, Sam thinks to himself, that's a trap. They are trying to lure me away from my campsite. Suddenly, he felt so scared he wanted to vomit, but he knew in order to survive this situation, he needed to keep his wits about him. So he puts his boots on and he grabs his knife, and he knows he's not leaving this campsite. In fact, he's going to build the biggest fire he can. He's going to stoke that fire as big as he can get it, and he's not going to go anywhere near that flashlight. For the next several hours, Sam just stood in the middle of his campsite holding his knife, preparing to confront whatever the heck is out in the woods. And over those several hours, he would hear footsteps approach his campsite, turn around, and leave. Every time the fire got lower, he noticed they would come closer and closer and closer, and when he would stoke the fire, they wouldn't come as close. But at about 3 a.m., he ran out of firewood, so unless he went into the woods to get more, he'd be out, and he's certainly not going into the woods. That's the whole point, is to avoid the woods where this thing is. And so as the fire died down, Sam prepared himself mentally for whatever happened next, because he knew that with that fire gone, this thing was comfortable coming all the way in, coming all the way up right next to him to get the flashlight. And so finally, he hears the footsteps approaching, and before this, the closest they had come was maybe about 15 meters away. They were far enough away it didn't feel intimate. It was terrifying, but he had some distance. This time, they walk right up to about 3 meters away, but they intentionally come behind the thickest group of trees, so he can't see them. And it's still dark outside, and he's in that bubble of light near the fire, so he's blind to whatever's on the other side of those trees. But he knows they're there, and they've stopped. And for 2 hours, this poor kid is standing in the middle of this campsite, facing in the direction of whatever is behind the trees. Probably his imagination is going crazy at this point with what could be behind those trees, just waiting for whatever happened next. But ultimately, the only thing that would happen is the sun would eventually come up, and right before it actually popped over the horizon, this thing on the other side finally moved, it turned around and ran away, and it did not come back. And so when the sun finally did come up, Sam didn't just charge out of there because he's still thinking there could be a trap. He waited until it was totally full sunlight, and then he packed up everything he had, and he practically sprinted back to the parking lot, back into his car, and he drove nonstop for 20 miles until he got to a gas station where he could park and collect himself. And when he got there, he got out of his car and he went in and he got a drink. And when he came out, he noticed someone had written something on the dust on the back window of his car. And he walks over and it just says, "Sleep well?" ? Sam is confident whoever was stalking him at his campsite is the same person or group of people that wrote this message on his car. And now Sam just wonders, what would have happened if I retrieved that flashlight? In the 60s, 2 high school classmates in South Carolina named Carol and Reggie fell in love with each other. Every day in the halls, they'd hold hands and they'd laugh with each other and whisper to each other. And then outside of school, they were inseparable. But despite their seemingly perfect relationship, it didn't last long. They both had different ideas about what the future should hold. And so after graduation, they broke up. Reggie went on to join the U.S. Navy, where he served for a number of years all over the world. He would at one point get married, but that marriage would end quickly. And then after he got out of the military, he got a job at a railroad back at his hometown in South Carolina. As for Carol, after graduation, she got married and divorced too, twice actually, but it was her second failed marriage that nearly killed her. On February 18th, 1987, Carol was living with her 10-year-old daughter, Rhonda, in South Carolina when her estranged second husband came up to the door and knocked. Carol opened the door, and her ex-husband drew a gun and shot her 6 times in front of her daughter before turning around and fleeing. The police would later find his body inside of his car on the side of the road. He had shot himself. As for Carol, the doctors were able to save her life, but the injuries she sustained from the attack were crippling. She was blind in one eye and she had chronic pain, and so her young daughter had to start taking care of her full time. Over the next 8 years, Carol steadily improved and regained some of her independence, but in 1995, she had a huge setback. She started feeling ill, and so she went in to see a doctor, and the doctor did a blood test, and they discovered she had liver cancer. It would turn out the blood that was given to her after the attack that had been transfused into her body to save her life, it had been tainted with hepatitis C. And so she got hepatitis C without realizing it, and because it had been untreated, it led to liver cancer. Rhonda remembers when her mother came home after being given this terrible news, she just sat down and was silent for a minute, and then she just kind of muttered to herself, "I just can't get away from this man. He's killing me all over again." But despite being dealt such an unfair hand in life, Carol was determined to not let her injuries or her illness define her. And so she went out looking for a job that could accommodate her physical limitations, and she found it. She was hired as a part-time customer service rep for a television cable company. She was very happy about this job and very proud of it because it was the first time she was working after the attack, and so for once it felt like her life was going back to normal again. A few years later, in 2000, when Carol was working at the cable company, her phone rang and she answered it the way she answered every other call, but the voice she heard on the other end, she immediately recognized. He introduced himself as Reggie Sumner, and so Carol asked him, "Are you the the Reggie Sumner from 1962 at Garrett High School in South Carolina? And he said, yeah, that's me. And Carol said, I'm your ex-girlfriend. We dated in high school. And so it was this incredible reunion, this totally chance phone call. And for the next hour or so, they just chatted on the phone about everything from their kids to their relationships they've been in to what they're up to now. I mean, they had a lot to catch up on since they hadn't seen or heard from each other in nearly 40 years. And so before they hung up, they realized they lived near each other, and so they made plans to get together in person. Rhonda would say her mother, when she came home that night, was like a 16-year-old girl all over again. She talked endlessly about how great Reggie was and how good-looking he was and how excited she was about their upcoming date. And so a couple of days later, Carol and Reggie have this date, and when Carol comes home, Rhonda would say it was obvious her mother had fallen head over heels in love with Reggie all over again. And luckily, Reggie had fallen in love with Carol too, because less than 6 months later, they got married and became Mr. and Mrs. Sumner. Within a year of their marriage, they decided to sell their home in South Carolina and move to Jacksonville, Florida to retire. Even though caring for her mother for all those years had been quite difficult for Rhonda, she said she was very sad to see her mother go, but at the same time, she was really happy for her because it seemed like she had found the one. Over the next couple of years, Rhonda stayed in touch with her mother, speaking to her almost every single day on the phone. But in July of 2005, Rhonda's mother stopped answering her phone. At first, Rhonda wasn't that concerned, but after 24 hours of not hearing from her mother or from Reggie, she did get concerned. Because even though Reggie was able to care for Carol, he wasn't in the best shape himself. He had debilitating diabetes, and he had recently broken his leg, and so was largely confined to a wheelchair. And so if they were to leave their house for an extended period of time, they wouldn't do it without asking for help from Rhonda. And so over the next couple of days, Rhonda incessantly called her mother and called Reggie, but she never got through to them. And so finally, after almost 72 hours of not hearing from them, she decides to just hop in her car and drive the 4 hours to Jacksonville to check on them personally. When she got there, she saw her mother and Reggie's car was not in the driveway like it normally would be. And so Rhonda went up to the front door and she knocked and she's yelling for her mom, but nobody's coming to the door, even though lights are on inside the house. And so Rhonda eventually tries the handle of the door and it's open. And so she opens it up, she steps inside, she yells again for her mom and for Reggie, but no one yells back. And then she sees their beloved dog, Mikey, that they brought everywhere with them, was still in the house. And so she's thinking, where would they have gone without bringing Mikey? And so Rhonda continues to walk through the house into the kitchen. And when she gets there, she sees on the table are 2 plates of food where the food looks like it's a couple of days old and it's just sitting on the plate like they had been eating it and then just abandoned it there. And then in the sink are all these dirty dishes. And then on the stove are half-cooked pots of food. And Rhonda knows her mother is an extremely tidy person and she never would have left her house with dirty dishes and food out on the table. And so red flags are going up for Rhonda. But what ultimately sealed the deal for her was when she turned and looked on one of the counters, she saw the cell phone that Reggie and Carol shared was still sitting there along with Carol's purse. And then next to that was both of their medications, which was Reggie's insulin and Carol's liver cancer medication, both of which were life-saving and needed to be taken every single day. There's no way they would have left the house without those things. And so Rhonda immediately calls the Jacksonville Police Department and she files a missing person report. And before long, the missing couple's story is all over the news and all of the networks are asking people if they have information to come forward. But no one came forward. And so the only lead the police had was to track down the Sumner's car, which was missing from their driveway when Rhonda showed up at their house. So the police shared the description of their vehicle all across the state, and very quickly they got a hit. The car had been found abandoned in a Florida town about 1 hour west of Jacksonville. It had been parked in this semi-forested, very secluded area off of a dirt road, and there was nothing inside of it, but they saw the battery had been taken out, leading some of the officers to speculate that perhaps the Sumners really had just driven away from their home without telling anybody and then ran into car troubles. But that theory would quickly be thrown out the window when 5 hours later, the Jacksonville police received a very strange phone call. The man who called in said he was Reggie Sumner, and he said he had seen the news about him and his wife being missing and that was just totally not true, that in reality they had left, but they were just fine and they'd be back soon. The police are immediately suspicious of this person. They don't think it's Reggie Sumner because, for one, he sounds like a young man and Reggie is a 61-year-old. And so the voice didn't really line up. And just the way he was talking about this disappearance like it was no big deal, that also just didn't really make sense. And so one of the officers asked Reggie, "Are you with your wife, Carol? And he said, yep, I'm with her. Here she is. And so a woman hops on the phone who says she's Carol Sumner, but she sounds far too young to be Carol Sumner, who's 61. This sounds like a 18, 19, 20-year-old girl. And she too just reiterates that everything's just fine and they've gone out for a couple of days. There's nothing to worry about. And, you police can stop looking for us. And so after this call ends, the police at this point are convinced that this simply cannot be Carol and Reggie. But to make sure, they call in Rhonda and they have her listen to the recording of this conversation with the so-called Reggie and Carol. And right away, Rhonda says, that's not my mom and that's not Reggie. And so at this point, the police assumed that these two people who called in pretending to be the Sumners probably had something to do with the disappearance of the real Sumners. And so while they waited for the trace on this phone call to come back, which would give them information about who was calling and from where, the police decided to investigate another angle. The police looked at the Sumners' bank statements and they saw their bank card had been used at an ATM in South Carolina after the Sumners had been reported missing. And so they called that bank and they asked for the CCTV footage from that ATM. And when they watched it, they saw that it was not Carol or Reggie Sumner withdrawing funds. It was some unknown man in his early 20s. Right after this discovery of this unknown man, the trace from the phone conversation with the imposter Sumners came back, except it was tied to a fake name at a fake address. So that wasn't helpful to the police in their investigation. However, when they went through this cell phone's call logs, which they got with the phone trace, they saw whoever owned the cell phone had recently placed a call to a car rental company in South Carolina. And so the police call this car rental company and they speak to the manager and they're able to figure out that somebody using this cell phone number had indeed called and had rented a car, and the car they rented matched the description of the car the unknown man was driving in the ATM surveillance footage. But this car had been rented to a woman. Her name was Tiffany Cole. The rental company told police that all of their cars had satellite tracking information built into them. And so police were able to use that information to track Tiffany's rental car to a motel in South Carolina. The initial thought was that maybe the Sumners are being held against their will in this motel. And so very quickly, a police force was organized, and on the morning of July 14th, so 6 days after the Sumners were listed as missing, they arrive at this motel, they go to the front desk, they find out what room Tiffany is in, they get the key, and they go up and they open the door. The Sumners were not inside. Instead, there were 3 young adults sitting there. It was 24-year-old Tiffany Cole, her boyfriend, 23-year-old Michael James Jackson, and his friend, 19-year-old Alan Wade. Also in the room were dozens of bags of recently purchased merchandise, like computers and video games and clothes and perfume. And also they discovered the key to the Sumners' vehicle and Reggie Sumner's prized coin collection. The police brought all 3 back to the police station and put them in separate rooms to be interrogated. At this point, it was obvious to police that these 3 had something to do with the Sumners' disappearance. They had all these things in the room that tied them to the missing couple. And so now the police, as they interrogated them, it was not so much about connecting them to the Sumners as much as it was about helping them find the Sumners. At first, all 3 of them either didn't talk or were totally uncooperative. But under intense questioning, Tiffany cracked a little bit. She said that they had robbed the Sumners, but nothing more. They didn't do anything else besides rob them. And there had been a 4th person involved in the robbery, 19-year-old Bruce Nixon, who was friends with Alan Wade. Bruce lived nearby, so the police quickly rounded him up and brought him in for questioning. And unlike the other 3, Bruce immediately caved. And the story he told about what happened to the Sumners brought many of the police that were involved in this investigation to tears. He said it all started with Tiffany. Tiffany used to be neighbors with the Sumners back when they still lived in South Carolina. Tiffany had a pretty rough upbringing and her father was permanently sick. And so the Sumners kind of took her under their wing and looked after her and built a very close relationship with her and kind of treated her like she was one of their daughters. Anything she needed, if she needed money, food, anything, they would give it to her. For example, in 2001, right before they left for Florida, they sold a car to Tiffany, but they sold it for basically nothing because they knew she didn't have any money and she really needed a car. 4 years later, in June of 2005, Tiffany was partying in Jacksonville, Florida with her new boyfriend, Michael James Jackson, when they got kicked out of the house they planned on staying in for the night. And so now they don't have a place to stay, they don't have any money, and that's when Tiffany remembers the Sumners had moved to Jacksonville, and they would always help her out if she needed anything. And so the two of them drive to the Sumner's house in the middle of the night. They haven't called them, and they just knock on the door, totally uninvited. And Carol comes to the door, and when she opens it, she sees Tiffany, and immediately she's like, oh my goodness, I haven't seen you in so long. Come in, come in. Who are you? Oh, Michael, great to meet you. Come on inside. I'll get you food. We'll get you fed. What do you need? What can we do for you? And so that's when Tiffany explains to them that their plans had kind of fallen through, and they didn't have a place to stay that night, and would it be possible to stay with them? And so Carol and Reggie right away say, absolutely no problem. Tiffany, Michael, you guys are guests here. You're welcome. Stay as long as you want. And so that night, Carol cooked a big meal for them, and they all sat down at the table. And at some point, Carol and Reggie talk about the sale of their house in South Carolina, and somehow it came up that they had made $99,000 in profit from this sale. And they were so happy about it because now they could really retire comfortably. And so as soon as they said that, Tiffany and Michael shot glances at each other because they knew they had to come back and rob them. The next morning, Carol and Reggie got up early, they made coffee and they made breakfast, and they were hoping that Tiffany and Michael would stick around for the day and spend some more time with them. But Tiffany and Michael were very quick to want to leave. They said, thank you very much, we got to hit the road. And so they left. And as soon as they get in the car, they start planning how they're going to come back and rob the Sumners and get their hands on that $99,000. 1 month later, on the evening of July 8th, after all robbery preparations have been made, Bruce Nixon and Alan Wade show up at the Sumner house and they knock on the door. When the door opens, it's Carol, and she doesn't recognize either of them, but being as kind and generous as she was, she said, hey boys, what can I do for you? How can I help you? And this was exactly what Bruce and Alan were expecting based on what Tiffany told them. She said this couple would be very easy to exploit. And they tell her that their car had broken down and they needed to use her phone. And so she's a little bit skeptical, but ultimately she says, sure, come on in. And so Bruce and Alan go inside the house, the door shuts behind them, and as soon as it does, one of them draws a fake gun that looks very real and pointed it at Carol, while the other one began tying her up with cord and with duct tape. And so Carol begins screaming and making a bunch of noise, and Reggie, who's in the garage out of sight, he hears her. He comes running in to see what's going on, and he sees these two men who immediately attack him, and Reggie's got a broken leg and he's already pretty weak and frail, and so he doesn't put up much of a fight. And before long, he and his wife were all taped up and restrained on the couch, and they were having duct tape wrapped around their heads until everything was covered except for a slit underneath their nose so they could breathe. And so with the couple completely under control and at the mercy of their captors, one of the men texted Michael, who was down the road with Tiffany inside of Tiffany's rental car, and the text just said, all clear. And what that meant was Michael could now come up and help them rob the house. And so Tiffany stays down the road in the rental car. Michael makes his way up. He goes inside, and he, Bruce, and Alan proceeded to ransack the house. And while these three men are moving room to room, taking all of their valuables, Reggie and Carol are probably thinking to themselves that, you know what, this is awful, we're getting robbed, but after they take whatever they take and they leave, we'll be fine, we'll recover. But when these three men finished taking all of their valuable items, they decided that they would also take Reggie and Carol. So they stood the couple up and they marched them into the garage and they put them in the trunk of their own car. At this point, Bruce left the Sumner's house and went down the road and got in Tiffany's rental car, and Michael and Alan, they got into the Sumner's car, and the two cars met up on the road and then drove 40 minutes northwest just over the border into Georgia, where they found this access road and they went down it until they reached this very secluded section of forest. This was not just some random spot in the middle of the woods in Georgia. This was a pre-selected spot that Tiffany and the others had been out to 2 days earlier to prepare it. And what they had done to prepare was to dig a grave for the Sumners. Michael and Alan, in the Sumners car, drove up right next to the grave site, while Tiffany and Bruce came up right behind them. And once they had all stopped, they got out of the car and they went right behind the Sumners car and they popped open the trunk. It's believed the temperature inside of that trunk was well over 100 degrees. And so Reggie and Carol were sweating profusely, and the sweat had caused their restraints to slip off their wrists and slip down off their face. And so the two of them were found holding on to each other and crying and praying. Seeing how weak they already were, the group decided they did not need to put new tape around their wrists or their face. They weren't going to go anywhere. And so they grabbed the two and they pulled them out and dumped them on the ground. It was probably around this time that the Sumners realized Tiffany was one of these 4 people that was doing this horrible thing to them. And I can only imagine the heartbreak they experienced. This girl that they took in under their wing, that they thought of as a daughter, was betraying them in such a heinous and horrible way. But there was no time to feel upset about it, because as soon as they were dumped on the ground, Michael grabbed Reggie and kind of threw him over to the side and said, "Sit down, don't move, or I'm going to kill you and your wife." And then the others grabbed Carol and dragged her away from her husband over to the edge of the grave, where they literally ripped the jewelry off of her face and off of her body. And then after all the jewelry was gone, they pushed her into the grave. Then they walked over to Reggie and dragged him over and threw him in with his wife. As soon as the couple was in the grave together, they repositioned themselves so they were both sitting up, one in front of the other, with Carol behind Reggie, and she threw her legs and her arms around Reggie, just kind of clutching onto him, and she buried her head into his back and she began crying. The original plan, apparently, had been to take the Sumners and put them in this grave and pretend like you were going to do something to them, to scare them into giving up all of their information, all of their banking information, and anything else that was valuable. And it worked. And so as Carol is crying into Reggie's back, Reggie is pleading with the group. He's pleading to them, "Let me give you everything I have. Whatever you need, it's yours." And so Michael said, "Give me all your ATM bank card numbers, give me your PIN numbers, everything." And so Reggie did. He gave him all the information he could possibly give to him. And then, for some reason, despite the fact that at this point, the group has taken everything of value from this poor couple. They have extracted all the valuable information they could possibly get from them. Despite that, they decide that that's not enough. They need to kill the Sumners. And they need to kill them in the worst way imaginable. They need to bury them alive. For hours, the group slowly, shovelful by shovelful, filled in this hole with Reggie and Carol sitting at the bottom begging for their lives. But the group didn't care at all. They just kept shoveling dirt down on top of them until the dirt and mud had gotten up to their necks, and the weight of the dirt was pressing in on their chests and was making it really hard to breathe. And so as Carol and Reggie are feeling this happening to them, they can feel themselves being crushed under this weight. Their cries for help become more and more desperate, but more spaced apart, because their breathing at this point is so labored, it's so hard to get a full breath, that they're conserving their air at this point. And then at some point, as the dirt crept closer and closer to their mouths, they had to tilt their heads up to try to get a good breath of air. But when they did that, they began shoveling dirt directly onto their faces, causing them to choke and gag. They're inhaling this, and it's becoming nearly impossible to catch a breath. They're dying at this point. And so finally, another layer of dirt was thrown on top of them, and they disappeared under the soil. But their sounds didn't go away. They continued to whimper and make sounds as more and more dirt was put down, until finally they had filled in the hole, and they began packing the dirt down with the backs of their shovels. And they could hear underneath the soil still the sounds of this couple dying. This was a slow and horrible death. After the killers were done, they left the site and they took the Sumner's car and they dumped it in Florida, where it was ultimately found. And then they all piled into the rental car. They went to an ATM and pulled some of the Sumner's money out, and then went on a spending spree. Here is a photo of Tiffany celebrating just hours after killing the very people that had taken her in and treated her like a daughter. After their autopsies, the medical examiner explained that both Reggie and Carol had dirt packed into their nose, into their mouths, in their throats, in their stomach, and in their lungs, meaning their actual cause of death was being buried alive. In exchange for telling investigators what happened and for leading them to the gravesite where the Sumners were, Bruce Nixon was spared the death penalty and given a life sentence. As for Michael, Alan, and Tiffany, they were all sentenced to. By the summer of 2007, Chris had been working as a park ranger in southeastern Pennsylvania for a number of years, and by and large, he enjoyed his occupation. Some of the time, he got to do what he loved, which was hiking in the forest. And some of the time, it required doing something he hated, which was office work that usually required staying late at night. On one of those late nights, in August of 2007, Chris's boss, Mike, said that he needed to leave the office and go down the access road to this tool shed they had. He needed to get some equipment and bring it back up to the office for some reason, and he said he'd be back in about 15 minutes. As soon as Mike left, Chris decided, you know what, I'm going to take a break from my work and I'm going to step outside for a minute. Right in front of the office building was a little staff parking lot, and then about 50 meters beyond that was the edge of this really dense forest where the access road that Mike had just gone down to get to the tool shed basically split right through the middle and went straight out past the office. When Chris stepped outside to take his break, he sat down on the front steps that overlooked that parking lot and the access road, and he was just kind of looking out towards the forest, not thinking about what he was looking at, just kind of mindlessly sitting there, when all of a sudden he just started to feel like someone's watching me. And instinctively, he turned around to look back into the office, as if maybe someone was behind him, but he remembered that he and Mike were the only ones there that night, so no one's going to be behind him. And so he turned back around and he looked out at the parking lot and he didn't see any movement, and he looked down to the edge of the forest, which he could see because the moon was fairly bright that night, so the illumination was pretty good. And there was no movement against the tree line, there was no animals, there was no people, and Mike had not come back yet. So there's nothing going on in front of him, there's nothing going on behind him, but he just could not shake this feeling that someone was watching him. And so Chris, he's not easily spooked. He's used to being out in the forest in the daytime and at night. He's used to being at this office. A lot of times he worked at the office on his own at night. So he's used to this environment. And so he thought, you know what? I'm going to go look around. And so he walks down the steps and he walks into the parking lot and he begins looking behind some of the cars. There's only a handful in the lot. There's nothing in the lot, and he keeps walking till he's about 10 meters away from the edge of the forest. And he looks into the forest, and it's too dark to see anything, and there's nothing out here. There's no movement, there's no animals. Mike is still not back yet. And so even though he could not shake this sense that someone is watching him, he felt like, you know what? I did my diligence, and there's no one out here, so it's just got to be in my head. And so he decides he's going to go back inside. And so he turns around, and he starts walking back up towards the office, when all of a sudden he hears this whooshing sound come past his head. And he didn't know what it was, but it sounded like someone took a stick and threw it overhand, so it's spinning like a tomahawk as it passed by his head. And because this sound was so loud and he was already on edge about someone potentially watching him, that he actually dove as soon as he heard it and fell to the ground and scrambled around and looked at the tree line from where this thing came from, but there's no one there. And he scrambles to his feet and he's still looking around, and he starts backpedaling towards the office with his eyes still on the forest, and his attention kind of shifts from the forest to what was just thrown at me. And he turns around and starts walking around looking for something on the ground, like a stick, to see if something really was thrown at him, but he can't find anything. He didn't do an exhaustive search. He didn't look under every single car, but an initial scan turned up nothing. And then he turns back to the forest and he doesn't see anything out there. And even though, again, he feels totally stressed out, like something's out here and I can't see it, he's like, am I going crazy? Did that really happen? Because I can't find this big stick that apparently flew past my head. So is this all happening in my head? But regardless, he's totally freaked out and he sprints back inside the office and locks every door. 20 minutes later, Mike comes blazing up the access road. He stops in front of the office and runs up the stairs. Chris goes over, unlocks the door, and he lets him in. And Chris is about to tell him about this crazy stick throwing incident, but he can tell Mike is really upset about something. Probably more upset about whatever happened to him than Chris is about this stick throwing thing. And so Chris tables his story. He locks the doors behind Mike and he turns to him and he says, "What's going on? What's wrong with you?" At first, Mike doesn't say anything. He just paces back and forth inside the office. And then finally, Chris calms him down and he gets him to explain what happened. Mike tells him that he was down at the tool shed, which is about a half mile down the access road and about 20 meters off the road into the forest. And he's at the shed, it's open, and he's pulling out the different pieces of equipment he's going to bring back to the office. And he says all of a sudden, all the hairs on his body stand up. He's got goosebumps. And immediately he thinks, someone's watching me. And he turns around and there's no one there. He looks to his right and his left. He kind of pokes his head in the shed, like is someone hiding in the shed? There's no one in there. He walks to the back of the shed. There's no one behind the shed. And he's just totally stumped why he's feeling this way. He goes back to the front of the shed and he's going over in his mind what made him feel this way. And he can't put his finger on it, but he cannot shake this feeling of someone watching him. And it's making him totally anxious. So he gets all the things he needs from the shed as quick as he can. He locks it up, he turns, and he starts speed walking back out to his truck. When he gets about 5 meters away, he hears footsteps running right to left behind him, back where the shed is. And because he was already completely on edge about someone watching him in the woods somewhere, he doesn't even turn around to see what that is. He knows he needs to run to his car and get inside and put steel between him and whatever is out there. Once he's inside, he locks the door, he turns on the ignition, and looks one last time in the direction of where he came from. And to his horror, there is a man walking into the woods right next to the shed, turning the corner behind and disappearing into the woods. His instincts were spot on. He was being watched. And that's when Mike hit the gas and sped back to the office. Chris then tells Mike about his stick throwing incident because all of a sudden that seems a whole lot more real, and they both agree that whoever threw something at Chris is probably the same guy who was hiding near the shed with Mike. Concerned this guy might come back and break into the office, they stay the night there and they watch the whole time. They don't see him again. And the next morning they file a report and they tell the incoming park rangers what happened. But after this, there were no more reports of this strange hooded figure roaming around the forest. And to this day, Chris and Mike have no idea who he is or what he wanted. But they can both agree, whoever he was bad. In the summer of 2015, a young man named Paul was on his last day of a 7-day solo backpacking trip through a very remote area in Utah called the Dark Canyon Wilderness. Dark Canyon gets its name from its steep walls that block light in the morning and in the late afternoon. It's an area that's only accessible by foot, and it's not uncommon to go in there and not see another person the whole time you're there. That morning, Paul got up and set off on a day hike that would take him through a very forested area up onto a plateau where he planned to camp out for the night. About a mile into the hike, he found some amazing elk antlers and he decided he wanted to keep them. So he threw them on his backpack and rested them at the top and continued on his hike. But the added 15 pounds of weight proved to be far more exhausting than he was anticipating, and very quickly he blew through all of his water. Even though he was within 1 mile of his final destination, this plateau, he decided to stop because he was so dehydrated, he needed to find water. So he puts his pack down, he puts the elk antlers down, and he starts walking around, and amazingly, he does find some water. Granted, it was kind of a gross puddle of standing water, but he figured I can boil this and it should be okay. And as he's preparing a fire to boil this standing water, he figures, you know what, if I'm making a fire here, I might as well just make my camp here. So he sets up his tent and then he makes a fire and he's about to start boiling this water when he realizes how dumb he's being. If there's a puddle of standing water right here, then probably just a little ways upstream, there's going to be some running water. Why don't I not boil this crappy water that will only yield, a couple sips of water and go look for the running water where I can drink as much as I want? So he puts the pot down and he leaves all of his gear at the campsite and he begins walking up this mountain to hopefully find a stream. And after about a half mile of walking up this mountain, he finds this little spring. Immediately he's down on hands and knees drinking as much water as he possibly can because he's super dehydrated. And after he's drank for quite a while, he reaches down to his belt where he kept his water bottles, and he realized he left all of his gear, including his water bottles, at camp. So he didn't have a way to collect this water. And so he's like, shoot, I gotta go back to camp and get the bottle and then come back. I'm gonna burn a bunch of energy. But he's like, you know what can you do? I need the water. And so he gets up and he turns around and he starts walking back towards his camp. And immediately he starts to feel really anxious as he's walking back. He can't help but feel like someone's behind him watching him. And he kept turning his head thinking he's going to see someone just over the mountain who's quietly stalking him. And he just could not shake this feeling. And so as he's walking back to camp, every little sound he hears is totally throwing him off. Every little rustling leaf, every little bird overhead, he's totally on edge because he's convinced someone is behind me or someone's over there someone's watching me. He finally gets back to camp, he gets his water bottles, and he considered not going back to the spring because he didn't want to cover that distance again because of how stressful it just was. But ultimately, he knows he needs the water. So either he's going to sit here for a really long time and boil a bunch of stagnant water, or he can just suck it up, walk to the spring, get some water, come back, and be good. Before he walks up to the spring, he grabs a really big stick to use as a club, and then he walks up. So now he's got some protection. And immediately, as he begins that half-mile trek to the spring, the anxiety pours right back over him, and he can't help but feel like someone is watching him. But he gets up to the spring, he fills his water bottles, he turns around, and he starts walking back, and he walks down this little rock face and lands on the trail he had just been on a minute ago, and he stops because he sees something on the ground that wasn't there before. A fresh mountain lion print is placed right in between two of his footprints that he had just made on his way back to the spring, meaning there's a mountain lion somewhere right around here that's not just watching me, it's hunting me. Paul doesn't really know what to do, so he runs to his campsite and gets in his tent and huddles in his tent for the rest of the night, hoping a mountain lion doesn't attack him. And fortunately, it does not. And what he thinks probably happened was when he picked up those elk antlers and put them on his backpack and was walking around with them, he probably attracted the mountain lion that thought he was an elk,